Welcome to Be the Game, the business of sports. I'm Alfred Edmond Jr., Senior VP and Executive Editor at Black Enterprise. And when it comes to the business of sports, there is no bigger name in sports media than ESPN. Get this, $30 billion. That's the valuation of ESPN based on the NFL acquiring a 10% stake in the brand in return for Disney getting the NFL Network, NFL Red Zone, and some digital fantasy properties of ESPN. Listen, you're talking about the biggest name in sports media, and we are here with the Executive VP and Executive Editor of ESPN, David Roberts. Welcome to the show, David.
Good to meet you.
So listen, let's start out this conversation. I mean, you're leading a major operation, news and entertainment, and a major brand in the business of sports. I mean, you don't get bigger than ESPN when it comes to sports media, obviously owned by Disney. But let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about your upbringing. I know you were born in Detroit. Talk about where you started.
I was blessed to be raised by a mother who raised 6 kids, pretty much by herself. But, the fact is, she was the number one role model in our household. And so growing up in Detroit was quite an experience because most folks that grew up in Southwest Detroit, where I grew up, didn't go to college. Most of us, meaning in the black community there, worked in the auto plants. So fortunately, I knew at an early age that I wanted to be in broadcasting, in journalism. So it made it easy for me to make decisions on education and just prioritizing what I wanted to do with my life, which I thought was a difference maker for me.
What was the turning point in your early life that said broadcast media was something that you wanted to aspire to do?
Well, there were a couple of turning points. One was, when I was 11 years old, and the riots of Detroit in 1967 were taking place, and the decisions were made by the local media outlets not to cover the riots because they didn't want to show the negative, or not the negative aspects, but the rationale for why the riots took place, meaning the inequalities and just the issue of police brutality and other factors that took place. So as an 11-year-old, I was curious as to why they didn't want to do that. So that was one of the motivating reasons that got me into this field. The other one was when I was in college, growing up, continuing the next phase, I worked at a place called the National Bank of Detroit. And from the time I was a senior in high school till I graduated from college. And what I saw during that time was they had all the black folks working on one floor, or 2 floors actually, at the National Bank of Detroit, on the corner of 4th Street and Woodward, in downtown Detroit. For those of you from Detroit, you know what that is. And so I was, again, curious about what was the reason for that. So I spent the last 2 years of my college education kind of researching the statistics behind the hiring practices of that bank. And it turned into a class action lawsuit for pretty much the hiring practices of that bank. So that was filed after I graduated, and it was settled 4 years afterwards. But what was the second turning point is I didn't like how I was necessarily portrayed in the coverage of when that lawsuit was filed. So that was the kind of like final motivating factor that inspired me to get into journalism.
It's a great transition to your career in television news, particularly in Ohio and in Atlanta. Talk about that, because you broke some major barriers in the positions that you eventually gained and were assigned in those markets.
Well, before I got to Ohio, I started out as a reporter
Yes.
in front of the camera, first at the first black-owned TV station in the country, which is WGPR in Detroit. And then I went from there to Flint and to Greensboro, North Carolina. And I guess the third turning point was I had a dinner with, if you're familiar with Bakari Sellers.
Absolutely.
Well, before Bakari Sellers was born, his father, Cleveland Sellers, and his mother had me over for dinner. And Bakari Sellers' father looked me in the eye and said, "Get off of television," and he didn't say it without using some colorful language.
Yeah.
"Stop trying to be a TV star and get into a position where you can decide
Yes.
you know what." And so that was the third point. And then I, started my career in decision-making roles, where I went to Detroit as an assignment editor and Fresno, California, and then back to Greensboro, then to Ohio, where I became the first black news director in Ohio. So that's how I got to the journey of not being in front of the camera and behind the scenes. So.
And of course, once you get to that point, then we get to the kind of the crux of our conversation today. We realize that news media,
Right.
it's a service, but it's a business.
Right.
And I know that when I discovered that, yes, the decision-making power, yes, it's about who gets to make the decision, but there's a business aspect to keeping media profitable and alive in terms of what gets done, what doesn't get done.
Right.
What was that transition like as you started to realize and learn about the business of media and eventually moving into sports?
Well, the bottom line in television, period, whether it's news, whether it's entertainment, is, are the ratings there? And if they're not, then the revenue won't be there. So that's a simple bottom line reality of our business. So going into these news operations where the ratings have to be at a certain rate or level so that you can monetize the viewership that you have or not. So that's just the reality. So when you go into those positions of news director, you have to operate with the understanding that A, you have to learn the market, know who your customers are, meaning the viewers, and you have to serve them with what the expectations are. So that encompasses a whole lot of specifics in terms of who's on the air, who's making the decisions behind the scenes, and the vision that you in that position of leadership must set to meet those expectations and those standards in those respective markets.
So talk about your transition from, let's call it general news,
Yeah.
to sports, and what moved you in this direction, especially getting to where you are now at the biggest sports media brand in the world.
I had a great career in local news and could have continued in local news, but fortunately I wound up at ESPN, where I've been for the last 21 years. And what I've learned at ESPN is it's a major mammoth organization, and you have to have people who actually believe in your potential and what you bring to the table. And I've been fortunate to work for a number of people who have supported me over the 21 years I've been at ESPN.
So let's dig a little bit into that. What were some of the key turning points on the way to your current position? And speaking as a boy from the Jersey Shore, grew up New York Giants, New York sports fan.
Right.
I'm fascinated about the work that you did when you were at ESPN New York. But talk about some of your journey, to your position now.
Well, when I left local news and I went to ESPN, I started out as a coordinating producer, which, some people would say, hey, that's a big step back from being vice president of news of a station in Washington, D.C. The way I looked at it, it was an opportunity to reinvent my own career vision, which is what I decided to do. Because again, I could have easily got another news director's job at that time, but at that point, my decision was I'm done with that merry-go-round, and so I'm going to try something different. And so that's again going to ESPN, learning what the cable news world of sports was about, gave me an opportunity to do a bunch of things, whether it was being coordinating producer of a sports center or Baseball Tonight, or overseeing ESPN News, which I ultimately did, and then to ESPN Radio in New York, where it gave me the experience and exposure to a whole lot of things, including doing rights deals like I did for the Knicks, Rangers, and the New York Jets at that time. So
I want to kind of go back and then come back forward.
Okay. All right.
You know, I explained to a lot of people about the media business as it's evolved, and you and I have both seen it evolve. I said once upon a time, the media business was like you grew tomatoes and you sold tomatoes.
Right.
And now it's you might grow tomatoes, but you're selling tomato paste, you're selling ketchup, you're selling, and it speaks to the diversification of what media is today, whether it's about digital, social, vertical, live streamed. And talk to me about the journey of going from, in the beginning, a news guy, a reporter, a station manager, whatever, and now with this broad, huge breadth of what's called media today. And in the case of sports, it's not just news, it's fandom.
Right.
You know, it's in many ways, it's much more emotionally connected to the audience than just kind of general news.
Well, it's everything from social to fantasy to just everyday news coverage to the actual live games on the air. It's exactly how you described it. But the bottom line takeaway for me and that to that question is the business has evolved to the point where you can't underestimate where the consumers are of the content that you want to provide. They're not just in front of that linear screen. They're on the digital platforms. They're on social. They're on audio platforms. They're in the print part of the digital world. They're everywhere. So you have to be able to adapt. But the only way you can adapt is you have to actually learn what's going on, what the trends are, where the industry is going, and you just have to be ready to be nimble and ready to be proactive and not reactive. Proactive.
Proactive, yes, yes. So now we're talking about your responsibilities at an entity that the most recent valuation because of the deal with Disney and ESPN getting 10%, the NFL getting 10% at ESPN so that Disney would get access to NFL Network, NFL Red Zone, your digital properties, fantasy properties. And so now it's considered a $30 billion valuation. And you're responsible for a huge chunk of that, of the performance. Because as I tell people, one of the things I love about media, and I compare it like football too. You're only as good as the last piece of content you put out. Like no matter how good it is, you got to do it again, and you got to do it again. And I call it points on the board. Right. So talk about what it means to put points on the board for the properties and the news and the entertainment properties that are under your. I mean, obviously, there's a whole army of people who are responsible for the success of your operation. But what does that look like for you in your current role?
Well, we're here in the studios of Get Up. That's one of the shows that I oversee, along with First Take and Sports Center, all those linear studio shows. And then there's the audio platform, ESPN Radio, the networks, and the local markets in New York and LA, and the digital editorial content, including all the investigative. So basically, those are the areas that I oversee. What are the points that you put on the board? You're talking about every day at between 4 and 5, I'm looking at the ratings as they come out. How did these shows perform in the last 48 hours? So every day you get kind of like a report card on how you're performing. In the digital editorial space, Bill Belichick didn't make it to the Hall of Fame. We broke that story, and you're looking at like more than 3 million page views of people who actually read that content. And then that content's discussed on Get Up, First Take, it's covered on Sports Center. So it's just an ongoing cycle of usage of the platforms that service the growing audience of ESPN, but it's not just what people see on that screen. Again, as we talked about, it's across all the platforms.
Well, yeah, I mean, the morning that we found out that Bill Belichick didn't get the first ballot Hall of Fame induction, and it wasn't even intentional on my part. I must have spent like an hour on Threads discussing that. Well, who are the top 5 NFL coaches of all time? And Bill Belichick is definitely one of them. And and like you said, it goes far beyond the old days, what I call the tomato growing days, when you just want to know who won the game last night, what was the score. It was just a sports segment in the news, and that was it, and it was over. And now you got ESPN. Now, when you talk about ESPN, it's the dominant sports media brand business. But you mentioned that thing about not letting yourself, as an individual professional, but as a company, become complacent. When you're king of the hill, what is it that keeps you saying, well, yeah, we're the biggest, we may be the biggest of the baddest, but we still got to do more to be more successful in this business?
Well, the beauty of the leadership of ESPN is we work for a company where the philosophy is never to be complacent, don't rest on your laurels, always being willing to take smart risks, and just to follow through on that. So when you have that kind of leadership, as we do at ESPN and at Disney, it sets the tone for what you need to be doing in your positions of leadership. The worst thing you can do is just stay in the status quo, and think that you can just ride the wave of being on top, because there's always somebody kind of gunning for you coming up. So,
I'm not going to make you say it. I'll say it. Sports Illustrated. But I'll leave it there. Once upon a time, nobody, Sports Illustrated was supposed to be untouchable in this space.
Yes.
And then, of course, ESPN, the magazine at the time, was one of those things that said, you shouldn't relax. Because, complacency is the last thing that happens before you get devoured. So I definitely appreciate that. So what are some of the realities that you face, and you touched on some of it, as you continue to raise the bar, deliver points, deliver ratings? There are revenues goals that everybody has. I mean, so this $30 billion valuation doesn't come out of thin air. What are some of the things that you kind of have to really navigate in your role on a day-to-day basis to do what you do?
You constantly have to be on that 24-hour cycle, meaning of something's always happening every single day, 24 hours a day. So you're gonna have to structure your day and your overall approach with that understanding. So, case in point, the day that Mike Tomlin announced that he was leaving as coach of the Steelers, ratings in some of those day parts were up 60%. So when I say 60%, it just said to me, and it also said to everyone, that viewers live in a cycle of immediacy, and you have to be able to provide that, because it's been said that you can get highlights on your phone and all that, but you can't get live coverage necessarily on your phone until after it's happened. So,
well, it's not only just immediacy. It's and I talked about fandom as opposed to just. I mean, fandom is part of news, but it's a different flavor because people are so emotionally engaged. One of my cousins is a huge Pittsburgh Steelers fan from back in the '70s. And it was an emotional thing. And your ability to capture that also drives ratings, also drives viewership, also drives somebody who has to get up every morning before they move on with their day because of a news story that breaks like that. So what I want to lead into, though, is going back to the 11-year-old who wondered why. A big part of your story is your own journey's impact on the broader business, and I don't mean just ESPN or media or news, but now you're not the 11-year-old boy wondering why, or the college student wondering why. You are now in spaces. You're in the NABJ Hall of Fame, National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame, because now you are a black man in the room.
Right.
In those rooms when as an 11-year-old you didn't know why things were. What does that look like to you? What have you seen change as you come up in the industry, broken barriers in different news markets, doing what you do at ESPN, which is incredible.
Right.
What does that look like from the inside as you've seen the industry change and in some ways not change, depending on your seat point of view?
The biggest positive that I will say is you look at some of the name brands that we have on ESPN,
Yes.
whether it is Michael Leaves and
Yes.
it was Elle Duncan who's moved on to Netflix,
Right.
but she came up through the channels of ESPN where she made her career, whether it's Shanae Agumake, whether it's Malika Andrews, whether it's Andrea Carter,
Yes.
and more. We have very much talented persons of color, and the reason why we have that is the commitment is there to grow that talent within, and so that's very important, and it's also reflective of that commitment that I'm talking about. And as a result, the viewers are better served because of those name brands that we have who happen to be persons of color.
So how does and I want to speak to you less as a journalist or
Right.
news person and more as a business leader in the organization.
Right.
How does your business mindset, your executive mindset, influence your moving through the organization and making decisions and influencing decisions around stories like this latest coaching cycle, which we went from 10 black coaches to down to 3 again, or there were 10 openings,
Right.
and we're down to 3. How important it is to have the people inside the organization have a sensitivity of that conversation, especially given, on the other hand, the close relationship between the sports leagues, NFL in particular, and ESPN as a news organization that has to cover that. I mean, I've always been very impressed with not with just the shows themselves, but the individuals on the shows, including former NFL athletes, who are able to have a very intelligent conversation about that without undermining the integrity of what's being reported.
Well, it's you get to a point where you know that people understand the importance of reflecting the market. When the 10th head coach was hired, one of the first big stories that came out of our digital editorial team was the fact that out of 10 head coaching openings, no African Americans were hired. And so that was one of the major pieces that came out. The commissioner, the state of the state was covered, and that's just part of serving the sports fan, but doing it in a journalistically responsible fashion. Because the one thing that we stress is that before you go on the air with opinions, there has to be fact-based material that support those opinions or the rationale for having those opinions. So that's
well, it's one of my favorite
important.
things about the intelligence, and I don't mean just IQ of people on the air. I mean the intelligence of the conversations being had around all these topics.
Right.
Whether it's something like, oh, we're all the black coaches, to something as to, well, should that coach have gotten fired, or why is that team losing,
Right.
or how is Shedeur Sanders being treated, and it's part of the authenticity that I wish I could tell people has to tie back to the performance of the business.
Yeah.
In other words, if ESPN loses credibility with audience, the audience will turn to other
Right.
sources of information and news and opinion.
Well, here another good example is Black History Month. We launched a whole new series of vignettes about Black history, and it's the banner title is "Be Optimistic." Vignettes featuring current African Americans making history and those in the past, but there's more than just doing 15 seconds. It's like 30 seconds, and whether it's Asia Wilson talking about how her grandmother wasn't allowed on the campus of University of South Carolina, and how now she has a statue where her grandmother wasn't allowed.
Wow.
Those kinds of stories, whether it's Bob Gibson, who, I didn't know that Bob Gibson was a Harlem Globetrotter.
I didn't know that
Yeah,
either.
you didn't know that either.
Right.
But again, the commitment, it starts at the top. You know, if someone said, oh, we don't want to do that because of the current climate that we're in, they could easily said that, but you know, it's been totally embraced and executed. Or HBCU live shows on the campus of Jackson State and North Carolina A&T with Sports Center as part of our Black History Month series. And we've had HBCU tours for the last several years. And that commitment, again, underscores our commitment to, number one, making sure that we serve the sports fans, and that's the bottom line. And you're not serving the sports fan if you're not covering what's important in the Black community.
And it's important to underscore when we say commitment, we're not just talking about good feelings.
Right.
There's a financial commitment.
Right.
There's a budget decision that's
Right.
being made. And there's performance expectations
Right.
that's expected to come out of that, because it still feeds to the overall points on the board
Right.
of the
Right.
whole performance of the organization.
Right.
Listen, let's kind of come down the home stretch, and I always like to finish my conversations. I don't call them interviews; I call them conversations with our guests.
Right.
With a future forward question. What do you see? What do you hope to see? Let's do it in 3 buckets for yourself in terms of where you're going during the course of your career, which it seems like you've been very intentional as you move from one step to another. What do you see as the points on the board that ESPN can put up? And then what do you see as trends, changes that may need to happen in the industry as a whole?
Well, my focus is on making sure that every day the best product goes on the air, and that those ratings continue to be where they are.
You're already
and
thinking
the
about those ratings for
yeah,
tomorrow.
Well, the whole point of audience expansion is one of our goals, and so that's where my focus is. But it's also focused on what the legacy is, and part of what is important to me is that there are other up and coming young African Americans who can also be sitting at that table that I'm sitting at. And so it's a priority of mine to, mentor these future leaders, current leaders, because some of them are already in VP level roles, but to make sure that I actually give back, so that once my time is done, and I go on to the next thing, whatever that is, that there's the momentum still in place through other talented folks coming up through the system. But I'll say this, for those who want to aspire to do what I currently do, you just have to accept the fact that it's a results-oriented business. You have to be prepared. And, the other thing that I've learned, that I've always known, is that not everybody's going to be happy with the decisions you make as a leader. And over the course of my career, and sometimes it comes from Black folks who don't like the decisions you make, and you just have to accept that and say, okay, so be it. Because sometimes when you're in a leadership position, that just goes with the territory. Someone gave me a plaque when I left Atlanta, or a little thing that said, a real leader is like an eagle. You don't find them in flocks. You find them one at a time. And so not everybody can be a leader.
Talk about the level of work that it takes. I mean, you're talking about a far-flung organization, constantly changing. You talk about the willingness to transform and to adapt.
Right.
That means time, money, effort, hours. Talk about the hard work that's involved.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week cycle. And
everybody
I don't
about
mean
that
that
life.
not everybody's cut out for it,
Right.
but I have a routine where, usually I'm on the treadmill at 5 o'clock in the morning or somewhere close. And that's where I kind of watch the overnight Sports Center, and where I can see it in its, in its full production, not half sleep.
Right.
And usually I'm in the office by 6:30, and there until the end of the day, and I watch the 6 o'clock Sports Center at home. But it's 7 days a week. So it's, it's a never-ending cycle. It's energizing, but it could also be sometimes exhausting, but it's just part of what goes into it. It's called hard work.
Yep.
And you don't make it in this business unless you're willing to work hard and also to collaborate and to support the agenda, the goals that go along with any company's agenda. So that kind of mentoring is more important than ever right now. And I'll say it because of where we are in society as a country. We have to accept the fact that you're going to work 20 times harder because there's too much at stake for you not to.
Yes.
And so that's where I'm at.
Listen, David, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you for being our guest on Be the Game, the Business of Sports.
Thank you.
My pleasure.